You see the promotion of college for all as an ideal in environments where most of the parents have not gone to college. And none of the administrators, none of the teachers, the mayor, the school chancellor, none of them say, well, we don't want to judge these people. We don't want to stigmatize, because we realize that generally speaking, parents, almost universally, parents want better for their children than what they have for themselves.
Hi again, everybody. Welcome back to the Narrative Podcast. Mike Andrews and Aaron Bear with you. And Aaron, it's just another busy season.
It is, man. There's never a slow season.
Well, here's the thing. I'm going to blame you because you just can't leave well enough alone.
That's fair. That's you sound like Maria now, because every time I come home and say, "Hon, it's going to be a busy season," she said, "You said that 3 weeks ago."
Exactly.
Sorry
like, all I want to do is enjoy these early weeks of the baseball season, watching my MLB TV subscription with four games at once.
Exactly. Yeah. we could just do that. David's not here. We could talk baseball. I mean, the Cubs are off to an amazing start, other than our bullpen being just completely insane. So we could just make this an entire baseball opening podcast. I know I'm fine with that.
I think we would have a market for that.
It really would. I've just talked. Which of our CCV supporters would want to hear me talk about the Cubs and how terrible of a GM Jed Hoyer is? Just really riveting stuff.
I could balance that out with the Ohio baseball perspective, so I think we can cover bases.
That would be too depressing. That would just be too.
Fair enough.
We don't want to lose too many.
Well, I joke, but the news today is that we officially announced the United States Christian Education Network.
Yeah.
And this is a new endeavor of Center for Christian Virtue to really take the model that we've seen be so successful here in Ohio and hopefully help other states figure out ways that they can build something similar in their different geographies. Yeah,
no, it's really a dream come true. I think for, as we've been growing more and more, we've had a lot of friends in other states reach out and say, how can we do what we're seeing happening in Ohio in our state, and especially on the Christian education side of things. And that's where sort of the idea of USEN was birthed. I think what's important about it is that where CCV is going is that we're going to build state models. We're only ever, Mahan's only ever going to be over at the Ohio State House, right? It's not like we're sending them all over the place.
Are we sure about that?
Right. Yeah.
Is it too late to
ship them off, right? But where he's at right now, actually, as we speak. But what we want to do is build out, take some of the successes that God's blessed us here and help other states do it too. And that's what USEN's going to do. It's kind of franchising the Ohio Christian Education Network and partnering with other states to do the same. It's super exciting too, because a good friend of mine, a guy that's been a mentor in many ways, Todd Mara, has come on board to help lead that effort. We have a partnership with the Association of Christian Schools International, ACSI, to be their official state-based public policy partner. And really, this was not necessarily intentional, but the combination of right as Trump is pushing all things education back down to the states, we're really in position to gear up state advocacy like never before in the education arena. Is going to be huge. That's more so than most issues. Education is a state issue, and most Christian schools don't have an advocate for them at the State House the way Christian schools in Ohio do because of OSEN. So yeah, big announcement today, big deal for us, and a lot more to come on that,
and a lot more work for the comms team.
That's exactly right. Exactly.
Is what it really gets down to.
That's right.
The other thing that we've been grinding away on, and as of this recording, we are exactly 1 month away from our first gala of 2025.
Yeah.
May 9th in Cincinnati with Sage Steele, and May 10th, we're going back-to-back, a doubleheader this year.
That's right.
Coming up.
No rest. Exactly.
May 10th, we're coming to Columbus with U.S. Senators Bernie Moreno and John Husted. So a couple of great programs that folks can now get tickets for. They're available individually or sponsor a table and come check it out.
No, what we've consistently seen with the galas is that CCV has our hands in so many things that it's when folks come to a gala and they experience those nights in community with other friends. It's just a lot of fun, but they leave really understanding what the Lord's doing in America, but in particular in Ohio right now. And so really excited about Sage Steele. She's someone I've wanted to bring in for a gala for a long time. We talk regularly about cancel culture And really you got to count the cost if you're going to speak out on some of these controversial issues, and you'd be hard pressed to find somebody who has done so more than Sage Steele. She was, at ESPN at the height of her career. She was the NBA Countdown host, and just could not go along with the trans agenda at ESPN, and walked away, which is just says so much about her. So I'm really looking forward to that. And then, honestly, for the Columbus Gala, with the Hope and the Future report that we just put out, we have two senators in Bernie Moreno and John Husted that really understand what's going on with families so well. And that's a rarity, right? That is a gift. To have two senators like that. And so really looking forward to having them together. That's going to be a really fun conversation. And yeah, like for anybody, we still have tables available, still have tickets available. But it is just, if you're looking around and you're a little weary by culture and a little weary of what's happening, those nights are always a great come recharge your batteries and get inspired and be a part of this work.
Yeah, just great opportunity to socialize with other people, to let you know that you're not in a vacuum. Yeah. You're not on your own. And
Amen.
Even for an introvert like me, I've had some pretty good interactions and conversations at those events. So it's a great time. That's kind of the overview of what's going on at CCV these days. But still, you mentioned David's across the street at the State House right now.
Yep.
It's budget season.
Yep.
We might not see him again until the end of June, which is fine.
Hopefully.
By the way.
Yeah, Lord willing.
Lord willing. Lord
He's
willing.
literally going to be on the interview in the next segment after this. But besides that, yeah.
Well, okay. But the more time he spends over there, the less time he spends in the office.
That's true. That's
good
factual, yeah.
But the House is now voting on what looks to be their final version of the budget.
Yeah.
By no means is this the final budget. We want to emphasize that. But still, seeing where it's come throughout the process, we've teased it a little bit, and we want to get more into it next week, hopefully. But some really big wins that we're looking at there.
Yeah, no, we're hoping next week to get the House Finance Chair, Brian Stewart, back on the podcast. You guys might remember he was on a few months back on the House Bill 6 stuff. But this version of what the House is about to pass is going to be one of the most pro-family budgets we've ever seen, and I'll try to save as much for it for next week as possible. But just to give a taste, I mean, $20 million to pregnancy centers included in here. Our bill to require age verification on pornography sites. A baseline proclamation that there's only that the state of Ohio only recognizes two sexes. Again, there's things like that have massive implications for the law. Other things like saying that sexual orientation and gender identity materials cannot be put out in view of minors in public libraries. I mean, honestly, guys, we probably have a list of 15 to 20 things that if they were standalone bills, we would be jumping through the roof to get these things done, and to get them all into the state budget in this way is unprecedented. Like this is probably the best example of just vibe shift. Is that you didn't see these types of things happening. I mean, even 4 or 5 years ago, let alone 10 to 20 years ago. And so it really is showing that the work that we do to say to these politicians, hey, culture matters, is really resonating. And we're getting serious about the things happening in our public schools, the things happening in our school funding. We didn't talk about anything about that yet, and I'm looking forward to talking about that, hopefully, if we get Brian Stewart on here next week. So, yeah, big day. Pray for David. I wanted to say, every time a new version of the budget comes out, it is 5,000 pages, right? Wow. And so it literally is an all hands on deck effort between, primarily Mahan and Troy McIntosh, who leads OSEN, Monty Lobb, who leads the Christian Business Partnership, and their teams, and a little bit of me, because I still like to pretend I'm a lobbyist from time to time, just combing through this thing, trying to, see, hey, what's all the good stuff that we fought for to get in there? Did it make it in? But then also, probably just as important, is there anything in there that we don't like, right? And what can we do about that? why does CCV own a building directly across the street from the State House? Why do we do these things? It's so that if we see something, we can just walk across and talk to somebody, or big picture, because nobody else is doing this, right? And you better believe, certainly the LGBT groups and Planned Parenthood, they're all going through these things, but every other industry is going through this budget and trying to see what they can get to benefit them and not your family. And that's what we're doing every day right now as we're going through this budget process. That's going to last until the end of June.
And when you say vibe shift, really we're talking about culture change there. Yeah. And I can't help but think of the video that we put together for the SAFE Act last year, which was called Culture Change, and talked about the process of bringing lawmakers along to see why it was so necessary. But it also, in that video, talks about what a seminal moment that was. And I think we're seeing that now, that these issues that are maybe cultural hot button topics are no longer off the table. It's not, I don't want to touch this. It's, no, we have to do something about this.
Oh, yeah. And as much of that too, we're not afraid of, like, because the media is still writing as crazy a stories as they've ever written about these things. But lawmakers are just, this generation of lawmakers are just like, we don't care what you say, right? We're like, we're just going to do what's right. We're not going to be bullied by you. And we've also proven that these are winning issues at the ballot box. So I mean, it really is a pretty huge deal to have. Again, we have things in there that say like, you can't use Medicaid for social transition of a kid, right? So think, typical gender transition is we're putting you on drugs or surgeries. But then there's social transition, which is like, we're just going to send you to counseling and teach you that you're actually in the wrong body. And then we're going to bill taxpayers, big bucks to pay for that counseling and through Medicaid. Well, Representative Adam Matthews brought forward a budget amendment to say, no, we're not going to pay for that in state Medicaid anymore. And again, that's just, if we just did that in a bill, we would be jumping through the roof on it, because it's such a big deal to do something like that. And it's just one amendment in a broad, big old budget that's getting considered right now.
And as we consider even some more national issues, we've talked about a number of things going on in the Trump administration. And one thing that kind of blends the two of what's going on in Washington and what's happening locally, there was a story about some Ohio State international students that have had visas revoked. It seems like the Dispatch, when they were reporting on that story, found some other similar situations at like the University of Cincinnati and Dayton and some of the other public schools in Ohio. So what's been going on with that, and what's your take on this?
Yeah, this was one little bit of news as we were sort of talking this week. One of my favorite things about our podcast is we get to, the original purpose of this thing, of the narrative, was like, let's look at sort of big media and cultural narratives and let's debunk them and talk about them and try to apply scripture to them. And I think this is such a great example of it, because the way the media is framing these stories out is, look how heartless this is. That the Trump administration is denying visas, denying college students the ability to, what they would say, the right to come back to Ohio State, for example. Which, one, as an American citizen, I have no right to go to college in France, right? I have no right to go to college in Canada, right? I have no right to go to...
Nor would you want to.
Right, exactly. I know that's very true. But even just the framing of that these are foreign-born citizens, right, of their country, which is, again, that's not a statement of value, it's a statement of fact. They have no right to attend an American university, especially then, and I think J.D. Vance has done a really good job of explaining this in the press, especially when they are being so hostile and derogatory about our country and our country's policies, and in many cases actively working to really build to tear down morale in these universities, build hostility towards the United States, build hostility towards Jews and towards Israel. The country has every right to look at these adults and say, no, we actually don't want you in our country for those. And by all means, you don't have rights under our Constitution, right? That the U.S. Constitution doesn't protect free speech in Mexico, right? It doesn't protect free speech. It has boundaries, and it has limitations of who it protects. And so, I think there's really some common sense around that. But then, my favorite example of this story was the first one that really came out about this was that a doctor who had taught at OSU Medical Center and was now elsewhere, I think that somewhere in New England, and she was allegedly top of her field. She had traveled overseas and was denied a visa to come back. And so, of course, the Columbus Dispatch writes all about how terrible it was, how this amazingly brilliant woman, doctor, was denied the right to come back to the country, and it was so awful, but never mentioned why she was denied entrance and even why she had left the country in the first place. And she had left the country in the first place to go to Beirut to attend the funeral of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah.
That's kind of a key detail.
That's kind of an important detail of why did she leave the country in the first place? And two, why would we say you can't come back? Well, if you're going to the funeral to celebrate, to honor the life of a man who's responsible for murdering thousands of Jews, who declares death to America, we probably don't want you in our country. It's probably not a safe thing or a good thing, and especially don't want to expose our best and brightest students to you and your crazy ideology. But of course, nobody in the Dispatch or other folks who wrote these stories thought that was a worthwhile detail to add in. And so when I see, again, I think for most folks now, when they see these stories, they take them with a grain of salt, or just don't pay them any mind. But it is such a perfect example of, you're seeing all these stories about these students being denied visas. Well, why are they being denied visas? It's not just something that, we want to stop kids from coming to Ohio State. There's obviously something going on here that triggered that decision.
Yeah, and if nothing else, just as a matter of critical thinking, it's always worth it to ask that question, the why.
Right.
And you may or may not be able to find a great answer, but in a lot of cases with these broad national stories, you are finding organizations that are reporting more details that help give you the full picture.
Well, and honestly, Mike, that's a good point. That most of the times I don't like both sides argument, but it is something I think that's if the vast majority of the time, if you're looking at something and you're saying, "Oh, why are they doing this?" and your answer is, "Well, just because they hate people and hate America," they're probably lying to you. Right. Like there's some justification. Now the justification may be equally as terrible, right? Like most of the trans stuff, like why, the people who are advocating for the trans stuff, they genuinely think they're helping people, right? So let's at least recognize, we don't have to respect, but we can recognize, okay, that's the place they're coming from. But it still makes what they're doing, in many ways, it makes what they're doing all that much worse and more dangerous. But we have to try to actually understand where they're coming from so we could properly fight it and properly address it.
Yeah. Well, we are going to take a quick break now, and then we're going to come back, and we have the privilege of talking with Delano Squires today. Mm-hmm. The Heritage Foundation has just put out a similar version of the Hope in a Future report. They took a look at marriage and families as well, and we're excited to talk with him. He is one of the authors of that study, and going to be a great conversation. We'll even get David to do some actual work today.
Go figure.
Here on the podcast. It's coming up next on The Narrative. Hey, Narrative listeners. Christians in the marketplace today face more unique and challenging threats than ever before. Businesses are following woke capitalism, chambers of commerce are beholden to social justice, and secular activists are chipping away Christians' First Amendment rights. As Ohio's only Christian Chamber of Commerce, the Christian Business Partnership stands in the gap to advocate for, to educate, and to celebrate Christian business owners. Joining the partnership also allows businesses to provide their employees with healthcare insurance, workers' compensation, and exclusive banking and educational discounts. To find out more and to join, go to cbpohio.org. That's cbpohio.org. And we are back on The Narrative. Mike Andrews, David Mahan, joined now by Delano Squires, who is a research fellow in the Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Life, Religion, and Family at the Heritage Foundation. Delano is a contributor to Blaze Media, and he's written articles for various media outlets, including the Federalist, the American Conservative, Newsweek, and more. He's a graduate of the University of Pittsburgh and the George Washington University. Currently, he resides in Maryland with his wife and their 3 young children, and we're so grateful to have this opportunity to talk with you today, Delano. Thanks for joining The Narrative.
Thank you for having me.
We wanted to talk with you because we saw that Heritage just put out a report on marriage and family. It runs very parallel to a lot of the work we've done here at CCV with the Hope in a Future report about family structure and stability in Ohio. So if you could, start us off with an overview of the Crossroads report that you put together and some of the key findings. If you're just doing an elevator pitch, how would you summarize the Heritage report?
So basically, what we wanted to do is look at the state of the American family. And our conclusion is that we are at a crossroads between tradition and modernity. We have certain statistics that point in one direction, right, in terms of the number of families who are still choosing to put marriage in front of carriage, so to speak. And then we have other statistics that point in the other direction, where you see more and more Americans believe that family and marriage, family, children are not even a priority, and you see that reflected in some of the data that we share. So if I could sort of boil it down to one thing, I think the decline in marriage has affected everything else that goes on in the household, and then that has spillover effects into all of the types of social outcomes. So if America had a marriage motto, we have gone from early and often in previous decades to less and later today. And that's one of the reasons why we see so many sort of significant changes to the American family and family structure.
Yeah, as you considered the statistics in your report, was there any one particular that jumped out to you? I know as we looked at our Ohio statistics, finding that I think it's around 42% of children in Ohio are born to single mothers, unwed mothers. So anything on the national scale that kind of tracks with that or jumped out to you?
I mean, that the national data tracks with that completely. It's about 40% of children nationally are born to unmarried parents. 23%, about a quarter, live with a single parent. I think the thing that probably stood out to me the most was that today there's a higher percentage of Americans who have ever cohabited than are currently married. That stood out to me because I think it shows a shift in where sort of our national values and priorities lie as it relates to family formation. But it's not that people have abandoned the notion of family. It's just that they're either doing things in a different order or they prioritize marriage less, and they prioritize sort of the traditional family structure, but also the family formation sequence, right? As we all know, it's first comes love, then comes marriage, then comes baby and a baby carriage. But for a lot of couples, it's baby, yes, marriage, maybe. And I think that stood out to me probably more than anything else.
First of all, I just want to thank you for your work that you've been doing, and not just the work, but the voice, right? Because one of the things that I pick up when you speak, it's not just the data, it's not just the history, it's the biblical worldview. And to me, that is what has been one of the supports in terms of the Black family over the years, that despite challenges, despite disparities, despite, this group or that group that might oppose the Black family, there was a biblical worldview there that allowed us to thrive through much of that. And just putting some data to it, one of the things that stuck out to me from your research was just how we are standing today in terms of marriage and family, 2024, 2025 stats juxtaposed against 1950, 1960, when you're looking at 78% of all American households, according to you all's data, were comprised of married couples. Only 4% of children were born to unmarried parents. These numbers, when I'm talking in churches and across the street at the State House, when you talk about the 40s and 50s, also when I'm talking to some of our Democrat constituents over there, and I tell them, hey, the African American family in the 40s and 50s, there was a larger percentage of our households had more fathers in the home than the majority race. And so a lot of folks just don't have the historical piece. But I do, probably towards the end of this, I want to talk about a little bit, where did we go wrong? Robert Rector, when I was talking to him the other day, he said, Dave, that the African-American family withstood slavery. They withstood Jim Crow. They withstood, the Depression. But this so-called war on poverty has decimated the Black family. And so, just kind of talk to us about what's going on historically as it pertains to the Black family.
Sure. It's funny you asked this question because I'm actually writing a book on this very topic. Tentative title is The Vanishing Black Family, and it's talking about, the current state of the Black family in America, where we were, where we are today, and where we need to be. And the first half of the book, sort of deals with some of the issues that you talk about, right? Like I talk about how slavery deformed marriage, which it did. It didn't destroy it, but it deformed it, because you think of just the nature of a marriage, what it is, right? That covenant union between one man and one woman for one lifetime. You think of the duties and responsibilities that husband and wife have to one another, right? Particularly husband, to provide and protect. You think about, sexual exclusivity and monogamy, cohabitation. Slavery made all of those things impossible, and certainly impossible to guarantee, because one party could be sold away to someplace hundreds of miles away, because they didn't have agency and autonomy in that sense. So I deal with that issue early on, but again, the conclusion is that it didn't destroy marriage in the Black family, because one of the first things that newly emancipated men and women did was try to put their families back together. So that desire for human connection and for marriage was not extinguished, but it was dimmed. And there's no way around that, because you can see that in the early 20th century. So I talk about how slavery deformed marriage, but to your point, when I get into the Great Society, war on poverty, big government liberalism displaced men, right? It created the illusion that Uncle Sam could be a stand-in husband and father for millions of low-income women, not exclusively Black, but increasingly over the years, it was far more prevalent in Black households. So slavery deformed marriage, big government liberalism displaced men, second wave feminism deceived women by giving them the impression or pushing the message onto women that femininity is weak, masculinity is toxic, marriage is oppressive, the home is a prison, and children are a burden. So these two, you have big government paternalists, you have second wave feminists, both rising. You have one is policy, the other is culture, both rising at exactly the same moment in the mid 60s. So what you end up having coming out of that in the subsequent decades is a parallel family structure where, again, the government, in the form of elected officials and unelected bureaucrats, assumed head of household status for millions of low-income women, particularly in this case, we're talking about Black women, in such a way where it created a new family and a new family structure that, ran counter to the traditional family structure. And then from there, I talk about how Black leaders denied the issue, right? Where you see this. So 1965 Moynihan Report, right?
Yep.
We're in the 60th anniversary of the Moynihan Report. And I wrote about that recently for National Review. About a quarter of Black children were born out of wedlock. That was seen as a cause for a national emergency, just to put this in context. By 1985, it went from a quarter in 65 to over 50% in 1985, and it's been at or around 70% since the late 90s. And throughout that time, you have civil rights organizations, activists, scholars in the Black community who just stuck their head in the sand. There's no other way to get around it. So they've denied the issue. And then in more recent years, and this is an indictment on a subset of Black churches and Black pastors who have defied God in their desire to go along with consensus in terms of changing the definition of marriage. famously, Barack Obama, when he was running for president, he told Rick Warren at a summit. This was in, I think, 2007 or early '08. He wasn't president at the time. Rick Warren asked him how he defines marriage, and he said, it's between a man and a woman. And, God is in the mix, right? This was a thing that was common. Most Democrats would have said that at that time. By the second term, he quote unquote evolved on the issue after his then vice president sort of got out in front of him in terms of supporting, so-called same-sex marriage. And it took Obama 4 years to evolve. It took, sort of the civil rights, liberation theology-minded black church about a week, because they posted the NAACP and I think, Reverend Joseph Lowry and some other, Julian Bond and some other sort of civil rights activists, from back in the day, sort of likened the fight for quote unquote marriage equality to sort of a new iteration of the civil rights movement. And since that time, you've seen those two things linked. And I think all of those things have served to further weaken the foundations of the black family. And the black family, in this sense, is really a canary in the coal mine, because some of the same dynamics in terms of public policy and culture you see working themselves out in white families, Hispanic families. The only major ethnic group today that is below what I would call the Moynihan threshold, right? 25% non-marital birth rate are Asian Americans at about 13%. White families are at about close to 30%. Hispanic families are a little over half, and as I said, black families are at 70%. So this is a nationwide problem, and I think this is why it requires sort of an all hands on deck approach.
I'm curious, in your opinion, you mentioned Barack Obama's comments, and that's something that we've highlighted, that this really should be a bipartisan issue, because Obama was talking about the importance of fathers back in 2008, I think is a quote that we pulled from him. We've got J.D. Vance now in the current administration talking about the importance of families. So if both parties can recognize that the fathers play such an important role in family structure and stability, but yet we've got one party that's just running so far afield from what the actual family is meant to be by God's design, like where is that tension point, and how can we get past it to still promote healthy family formation, even as the left is just saying, well, anything counts as a family that you want it to be?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in retrospect, and certainly in today's political climate, Barack Obama is an anomaly. I've said to people, even here at Heritage and other conservative spaces, in my lifetime, he was by far the president who most consistently made a link between marriage and family structure and social outcomes. Right now, some of the publications, I'm thinking about Ebony and Essence, right? Sort of the black publications that featured him and his wife, promoted quote unquote black love and relationships, and they promoted them as an archetype, almost like the new Cosby family. But what he did was to say, on the south side of Chicago, if we want to address violence, we need intact families, we need fathers in the home. Right? He did this consistently, sometimes to his detriment, his political detriment, right. Because when he did it, he would always be criticized on his left flank by progressives who would say, no, the issue is not marriage and fathers. The issue is we don't spend enough on social services. I give some of that historical context because since Obama, I cannot think of a single sort of nationally elected Democrat. I'm not talking about a local leader or a mayor. I can't even think of any of them, to be honest. But I can't think of a single nationally elected Democrat who does what he did in terms of making that connection between family structure and social outcomes. My sense is that they all saw the criticism that he received from that, and they figured it's not worth their time and the political capital needed to engage in that sort of, rhetorical fight. So I agree with you. It's like the left has ceded this entire issue to the right. I'm not sure if the tension can be resolved in the near future. Part of the reason is because part of it is ideological, because what you have among progressives are people who believe that social spending is really what counts. It's resources. So if you increase the amount of resources going to single mothers and their children, then you can counteract some of the losses, at least the financial losses that come with not having, a father in the home. Obviously, we would disagree with that premise, but I think that's where they're operating on. So part of it is their worldview as progressives in terms of seeing the government as being able to right some of those wrongs, particularly with respect to resources. But it's ideological in another sense as well, because these are people, and I'm not saying this to be sort of pithy or cute. These are people who literally cannot define the words man and woman.
Right.
And if you start from that position and you reject biological sex, there's no way you can get to sort of the biblical family structure, right? So I think any hope of sort of mending this gap is probably first going to have to start on the left with promoting responsible fatherhood, with addressing the issues that boys and men are having. And you see people starting to tack in this direction. You have Governor Whitmer in Michigan. You have, my Governor Westmore in Maryland, who are saying, boys and men are in a state of crisis and we need to look at that and we need to do something about that. But when it comes to talking and making a crystal clear public argument for sort of restoring and rebuilding the traditional family, that's going to be hard because, as I said, you have your big government liberals who are going to talk about resources. You have your feminists who are going to say that talking about family in this way is regressive and really is about controlling women. You have your LGBTQIA plus activists, which again make up a big part of the Democratic base, who are going to say our definition, the biblical definition of family, is far too restrictive. And then you have other groups who will say this is not where politicians and public policy should be spending its time. So I think it's possible to sort of bridge the gap. I don't see many signs that it's going to take place anytime soon.
Yeah, I'm there with you. I had a meeting just last week. Good guy, Democrat guy over there, and one of the big C's in the state, and that's about as much as I'm going to give in terms of who that was. But when I gave him the Hope in the Future report, Delano, and I'm breaking down all the negatives, right, that we break down, that we're seeing a direct line between the proportion of unmarried mothers and poverty, child poverty. When you look at our Youngstown, that 50%, child poverty. They also have a very high percentage of unmarried mothers. But then I took him to the success sequence, right, where it says, while African Americans, and this was an African American member, when I said, even though we do see disparities when Black and brown kids do not go through all three stages of the success sequence, right? Graduate high school, get a full-time job, and then have children inside of marriage. When they do, 96% of those kids, avoid poverty. And so they completely destroy the racial gap. After giving him all of that good news, he said, yeah, Dave, I'm with you there on the success sequence, but marriage is not really, it's not really realistic in my district. I could not believe that those words came out of his mouth. Wow. Because of how many broken families we have, it's unrealistic to think that we could ever get back there. We all know how ridiculous that is, but I would like to talk about how we got there, because again, we talked about the 40s and 50s, the families were strong, not just African American families, the American family was strong. Something happened with the war on poverty, and it was not the spoken intent of LBA for it to be the $1 trillion a year mess that it is now. It was actually intended to strengthen the family, to strengthen the work ethic. And what happened there?
Well, so I actually want to address the first part in terms of the conversation you had with the member.
So we got to go back.
Yeah, and the reason why is because I see the exact same thing here in the DC area, right? Like I would like to work with some of the family strengthening collaboratives that do work, in some of these communities. And I was looking at one that produced a report, an annual report, and they talked about work that they did for seniors, violence prevention work to keep, kids out of child welfare, rehousing, food, clothing, active shooter training, Narcan, and opioid awareness. Nothing about relationship counseling. Nothing about marriage counseling, marriage prep. Not even anything on co-parenting that I saw. And I actually think we would see his statement as ridiculous. I actually think that statements like that and sort of the complete disappearance of anything related to marriage and relationships in some of these communities is actually a realistic response from these individuals, right? I think they're reacting to what they're seeing because, and again, I don't know the member, but if I had to guess, I'm assuming he would say, look, I'm looking at some of these kids in these houses. There hasn't been a married couple that they've seen in their entire lifetime, and probably not at best since their grandparents' generation. So not their parents, not any of their aunts and uncles, not any of their first cousins, not any of their fictive kin, play cousins, god brother, god sister, none of. So you're talking about areas where, and I like to think of marriage culture in the same sense of in the same way as I think of agriculture. You're talking about a field where nothing has grown in generations. So when they hear us come and say, look, you throw the seeds down, one man, plants, another man waters, and God gets the increase, they're saying no. Nothing grows here. Only weeds grow here. So I do think there needs to be an attempt to sort of, for lack of a better term, break up the ground. I think what you did, sharing the success sequence, is part of that. I think there are other ways to at least raise consciousness, bring awareness to some of these issues, and then slowly but surely, it could look like introducing the success sequence in an after-school program for middle and high school kids. And eventually it could look like introducing it into curriculum in public education. It could look like, marriage, relationship classes, particularly for cohabiting couples with children. Right. So I think there are ways to go about this. But I'm not surprised by what that individual said because I'm seeing it, in my own work. And again, so to your question about in terms of how we got here, as I said, I think one of the things that Moynihan talked about in his report, and again, I think this is broadly applicable, is that once something, and I'm paraphrasing him here, once something sort of sets in as a cultural norm, it no longer needs the specific factors that created it to continue its momentum, right? Think about when we were kids and we watched Looney Tunes and you see, the Roadrunner push, a little pebble or push, think of an avalanche. That's probably a better example. It starts off small, and as it rolls down the mountain, it gets larger and larger, but it's continuing on its own momentum. You don't have to keep pushing it down the hill. And I think marriage culture is like that. And once the separation of marriage and child rearing becomes established as a cultural norm in a particular family, community, city, state, or country, or civilization for that matter, you no longer have to keep saying, have a kid out of wedlock, you'll get welfare, or, women don't need marriage. It'll just, this is the new norm. This is what we do in our family or in our community. You get a certain age, you date somebody for a little bit, nobody's celibate, so it's just like, okay, sex happens, baby comes, I'll step up to the plate and fulfill my responsibilities. Marriage is not on the table. Eventually you break up, you move on to somebody else. And going back to the report, we talked about the rise in multi-partner fertility, where you see an increasing number of Americans who have more than one child, have those children with more than one partner. And this is what you get when marriage is removed. You get a series of short to medium to long-term relationships that start, exist for a period of time, that end, where children are produced, and then people continue to move on. And one of the things that I think is that in some American towns or small cities, on our current trajectory, there are going to be people who end up getting into relationships with their half sibling. Because again, if you keep getting in and out of relationships, breaking up, kids are being born, the family tree, I don't even think we have technology to sort of graph what these family trees are going to look like, because you're going to have branches all over the place and people are not going to know, oh, wow, like you and I are related through, this particular person, and I didn't even realize that. So there's a lot going on, but I think a big part of it is that this has settled in as a cultural norm, and without something to force us to dislodge it, we're just going to continue on this same trajectory.
Yeah, the word that came to mind as you were talking there to me was optional. Like this has become, fathers have become optional.
Yes.
And that goes to the government side. Like you don't need a father to provide in the home because the government's got you. You don't need a father in the home because you can have a cohabitating partner. You don't even need a father involved at all because two moms are as good as a mom and a dad. Like that's what it seems like this overall kind of ethos is going through the culture right now. And while we certainly I want to agree with the Apostle Paul, like he didn't say everybody's got to get married, but you also can't devalue marriage to the point that it has been and expect it to have the roots necessary to hold up a thriving society.
Yeah, and I've been thinking about this a lot because, as I said, any attempt to sort of restore the biblical family model is going to be met with opposition. As I named some of the groups, right? They're also going to be, if I'm being completely frank, there will be some people on the center right who will cheer from the sidelines. But when we really get down to brass tacks and talking about marriage as a permanent union, some of these individuals, particularly the ones who've been divorced, may start to feel like, feels a little bit judgmental, right? We shouldn't be telling people how to live their life, and kids are resilient, and so I think to your point, if I'm thinking about sort of the 5 heartbeats of a healthy marriage culture, it's that marriage has value, it's that sequence matters. We talked about success sequence. Timing matters, right? Because I'll give this example. If I get married at 37 and have my first kid at 40, and I have a son and he follows in my footsteps, married at 37, first child at 40, I become a first-time granddad at 80 years old, if I make it that far, right? So sequence is important, right? Marriage before carriage, but timing is important. Is that marriage is a permanent union, right? So meant to last a lifetime between one man and one woman, and that there's nothing wrong with having more than 2.1 children. Because some of the conversations you'll probably hear, you hear a lot in this space are about the fertility rate and replacement. And sometimes I think particularly anyone who's under the age of 60 who's been raised in a sort of post-feminist culture, we don't necessarily look at kids as gifts from God. On the pro-abortion side, children are consequences that get in the way of female self-actualization. But even among sort of pro-family folks, it's just like, well, if I get a boy and a girl, first 2 shots, I'm good. So families that are larger, and actually I have 4 children now, so I need to update my bio. But families that are larger, 4 or 5, and if you hang around in religious circles, then you really start to see the numbers pump up: 6, 7, 8, 10, 12 kids.
Now we're talking about Mike.
Hey, come on. Only six. He got me in sticks, all right?
So people will look at families like that and like, oh, that's kind of strange. You must be some fundamentalist. But I want to say something else, because one of the things that I like to address is even among conservatives, sometimes what we do, we'll talk about marriage with respect to having a father in the home, which is a good thing. But in some respects, it sort of disembodies the household, because when the emphasis is on the father, that speaks to his role with respect to his children, which is important. But within the context of a marriage, husband and wife have duties and obligations to one another, right? So I often say that marriage is a natural habitat for a man because he lives longer, he eats better, tends to be, more content. And
Doesn't do his dumbest stuff.
Right.
Arguably. Yeah.
But when we get older and we need someone to look after us and make sure we're going to our appointments, right? Or when our wives need a certain level of emotional support and comfort to know that, things are going to be okay. We miss that if all we do is talk about fatherhood, right? There is no vow to stay together, in sickness and in health in any cohabitation agreement, any divorce decree, or any child support order that I've ever heard of. So part of what I like to do is to refuse those two vocations of husband and father so that they remain the Siamese twins that they've always been. Because I think it's easy sometimes, and you'll hear this sometimes on the center left, to talk just about fatherhood and ignore the roles that we play in our households and the responsibilities that we have to one another as husbands and wives.
I've noticed that, in my work across the country, when we're talking about fatherhood in the context of state government, they really don't have a problem talking about fatherhood as long as we're, focusing on dads in jail, who
Right.
need to be reconnected to their kids, but completely devoid and decoupled from any kind of marital relationship. So that's a very good point. Fatherhood commissions all across the nation are thriving, and they're getting funding, but they're not talking about marriage. They will not go there, and so they tend to focus on prisoners.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate. I get the idea of, from a policymaker's perspective, meeting people where they are, but at a certain point we have to get back to ideals.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons people are reluctant to do this is because they feel speaking about an ideal inherently is a judgment against people who haven't met that ideal. And what I respond to is to say, look, we already know how to do this. If you go in any school district across the country, even in urban low-income districts, and you go into any K through 12 school, particularly like the younger ages, you're going to see banners up for Harvard and Howard and Ohio State, the Ohio State, and all these other schools, and you see the promotion of college for all as an ideal in environments where most of the parents have not gone to college. And none of the administrators, none of the teachers, the mayor, the school chancellor, none of them say, well, we don't want to judge these people. We don't want to stigmatize, because we realize that generally speaking, parents, almost universally, parents want better for their children than what they have for themselves. And I think we can talk about marriage in a similar way without, stigmatizing individuals or shaming them, even though I do think shame in its proper proportion, used as a prophylactic, is a powerful tool for behavior modification, right? You can tell the boys and the girls who have not had kids yet out of wedlock, look, if you do this, your life's going to be more difficult. She's probably not going to stay with you. He's probably going to leave, so on and so on and so forth, right? Or you can pitch it in our household, we put marriage before carriage. Never forget that. But once the baby's here, the baby 15 years old, you can't talk about, man, you should have got married. It's like that ship has sailed.
Right.
But I do believe if we want to use the stick of shame, which I think of this as a tool belt. It's one of the tools in the tool belt. I'm much more open to using it for institutions that either refuse to acknowledge the importance of this issue or stand in the way of progress when it comes to this issue. So if I approach the NAACP, and I'll use one, and I say, hey, I think we should do a marriage rebrand and a national campaign to restore and rebuild the black family. And they say, well, we can't do that if you're not willing to feature some same-sex couples in your promotional materials. I have no problem going to social media and saying, look, these people, name, rank, and serial number, Derek Johnson, the CEO of the NAACP, refuses to do a black family reconstruction campaign because he's concerned about, I don't know, the 0.5% of same-sex couples that are raising kids. I have no problem shaming someone like that. So it's all about using the right tools, for the right job. And I think there's ways to do that.
Well, Delano, I feel like we've barely scratched the surface here today, and we're already bumping up against our time. So thank you so much for this conversation. It's been incredibly informative. I feel like we need to have a part 2 at some point down the road. But
I'm down for that.
For now, can you tell our audience where can they get the report? Where can they follow your work?
So they can follow me on X. I try to stay out of trouble, varying degrees of success. My handle is at Delano Squires, DELANO SQUIRES, all one string. And then all of my writing shows up that I do for Heritage shows up on my personal page at Heritage, which is heritage.org/Delano Squires. And they can find the report there and anything else that they're looking for there as well.
Well, keep up the great work. We're so grateful for you. And thanks again for the time and for joining The Narrative today. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Narrative, presented by CCV and produced by Wessler Media. If you found today's episode insightful, leave us a review or rating and subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. We're your hosts, Mike Andrews, Aaron Baer, and David Mahan, and we'll see you next time on The Narrative.